The air in the sterile, top-floor office was so cold it felt like a physical weight on Sanaa's skin. It smelled of expensive leather and something metallic, like old blood scrubbed clean. Her father, Marcus, sat opposite a man whose stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. His name was Kong Minjun. He was a specter in the city's underworld, a name whispered with a mixture of terror and reverence. He wore a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to his lean frame, his dark hair immaculately styled. He hadn't said a word in 10 minutes, simply observing them with eyes that were black, flat, and utterly unreadable. Marcus, however, couldn't stop talking, his voice a desperate, sycophantic river of words. He was sweating, his own cheap suit dampening at the collar. Sanaa stood beside her father's chair, a silent, rigid statue. She had been coached on what to do. Stand straight, look down, do not speak unless spoken to. Be agreeable. Be an asset. She was the final, desperate payment for a debt her father could never hope to repay with money. She was 23 years old, and her life was being bartered like a used car. She's a good girl, Mr. Kong.
Strong.
A hard worker, Marcus blathered, gesturing vaguely in her direction without looking at her. She'll be a fine addition to your household. Very loyal. You won't have any trouble from her. I guarantee it. The words were a vile echo of every threat he'd ever used against her. Don't cause trouble. Don't embarrass me. Minjun's gaze finally shifted, leaving Marcus and landing on her. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was analytical, like a jeweler inspecting a flawed stone. He saw the faint, faded scar near her temple, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. He saw everything. Sanaa forced herself to meet his eyes for a single, defiant second before dropping her gaze to the plush, dark carpet as instructed. In that fleeting moment, she saw no cruelty, no avarice. She saw only an unnerving, profound emptiness. It was somehow more frightening. Minjun finally leaned forward, the slight movement silencing Marcus instantly. He placed his hands on the polished mahogany desk, his long fingers steepled. His voice, when it came, was a low, quiet baritone, devoid of any accent. You brought your daughter here to settle your account. It was not a question. Yes, sir. A permanent arrangement, Marcus confirmed, his relief palpable. A marriage, if it pleases you. To seal our partnership, Minjun's eyes flickered back to the older man, a flicker of something that might have been contempt crossing his features. There is no partnership, he stated coldly. There is only your debt, and your pathetic attempt to pay it. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Marcus's face fell. Minjun rose from his chair, a fluid, silent motion that spoke of immense, contained power. He walked around the desk, stopping not in front of Sanaa, but in front of her father. He was taller than Marcus, leaner, yet he seemed to eclipse him entirely. He looked down at the trembling man. You value your child so little that you would trade her for your own worthless life. Again, not a question. Sanaa held her breath. This was not how she had imagined this would go. She had prepared for disgust, for dismissal, for being treated like an object. She had not prepared for this cold, precise dissection of her father's character. She is all I have left to offer, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Minjun's gaze was utterly dismissive. Get out, he said, the words as sharp and final as a blade. Marcus stared, confused. But the deal?
Sanaa?
Minjun turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Sanaa's again. He spoke to her, but his words were a judgment upon her father. He is no longer your concern, then. He looked back at Marcus, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. I said, get out. Do not contact her. Do not come within a mile of any of my properties. Do not speak her name again. If you do, I will remove your tongue myself. Marcus froze. His face, a mask of shock and terror, was pale. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over his chair in his haste. He gave Sanaa one last, panicked look, not of concern, but of utter bewilderment. Then he fled, the office door clicking shut behind him, leaving an echoing, profound silence. Sanaa was left alone with the man who now, apparently, owned her. But he hadn't looked at her like property. He had looked at her like a survivor. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Sanaa remained perfectly still, her mind racing. The script she had rehearsed, the future she had braced for, had just been torn to pieces. Minjun walked back behind his desk, not sitting, but leaning against it. He watched her, his expression unreadable as ever. "He will not bother you again," he said, his voice returning to its neutral, quiet tone. It was a promise. A terrifying, wonderful promise. Sanaa found her voice, though it came out as a strained whisper. What do you want from me?" She finally lifted her head, meeting his gaze fully. She needed to know what cage she had been moved to now. He considered her for a long moment. "For now," he said slowly, "I want you to breathe." He gestured to a door she hadn't noticed before. "My driver will take you to my residence. You will have your own rooms. You will be safe there." The word safe was so foreign, so utterly alien in the context of her life, that she almost flinched. Safety was a lie her father had used before delivering a blow. Safety was a locked door she could never seem to find the key for. She didn't move, suspicion and fear warring with a desperate sliver of hope. "Why?" she asked, the single word holding the weight of a lifetime of questions. Why save her from him? Why this strange, detached kindness? Why her?
Minjones gaze softened almost imperceptibly.
"Because my business is with men who make foolish wagers," he said. Not with their daughters. He straightened up, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Dinner is at 8. I will see you then." With a final, brief nod, he turned his attention to some papers on his desk, a clear dismissal. She was being sent away, not to a cell, but to a life she couldn't begin to comprehend. The penthouse was a palace of glass and steel overlooking a glittering cityscape. It was beautiful and sterile, a gilded cage far more luxurious than the one she had just left. A silent, older woman showed Sanaa to a suite of rooms that were larger than her father's entire apartment. A bedroom with a cloud-like bed, a bathroom of marble and chrome, and a sitting room with a floor-to-ceiling window. Clothes had already been laid out on the bed, simple, elegant pieces in soft fabrics and muted colors. Nothing garish or revealing. It was another confusing gesture in a day full of them. Sanaa spent hours just standing by the window, watching the city lights blink on as dusk settled. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to reveal its price. When a soft knock came at her door precisely at 8, she tensed. It was the same housekeeper. "Mr. Kong is waiting for you in the dining room, Miss Mississippi." Not an object, not a payment. Mississippi. The dining table was long enough for 20, but it was set for only 2, at one end. Minjun was already there, standing as she entered. He had changed from his suit into a simple black sweater and dark trousers. He looked younger, less like a crime lord and more like a man at rest in his own home. He pulled out her chair for her, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt jarringly gentle. They ate in near silence. The food was exquisite, but Sanaa could barely taste it. She watched him, trying to piece together the puzzle of this man. He ate with a focused, deliberate grace. He wasn't ignoring her. His awareness of her was a palpable presence in the room. But he didn't press her, didn't force conversation. "Is the food to your liking?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through the quiet clink of silverware. Sanaa jumped slightly.
"Yes."
"It's very good. Thank you. If you have other preferences, you need only tell the cook," he said simply. Her father had never asked her what she liked. He'd given her whatever was cheapest, or whatever scraps were left. "I don't have any," she replied automatically, the old habit of making herself small and undemanding dying hard. A flicker of something crossed his face. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he changed the subject. "There are books in the library. A media room. An art studio if you have any interest." He was offering her things to do. Hobbies. As if she were a guest. As if this were normal. "What are the rules?" she asked, her voice blunt. She needed to know the parameters of this new prison. He set his fork down, giving her his full attention. "You are not to leave the building without my knowledge. For now, that is for your safety. My enemies are not considerate, the implication was clear. You'll be treated with respect by my staff. If anyone fails in this, you will tell me. He paused, his gaze intense. And you will not be expected to do anything that makes you uncomfortable. This is not a transaction, Sana. It is a sanctuary. He used her name for the first time. It sounded different in his mouth. Not a curse, not a summons, but just a name. A name belonging to a person. A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away furiously, embarrassed by the show of weakness. He pretended not to see it. He simply picked up his fork and continued eating, giving her the space to compose herself. In that moment, a tiny seed of trust was planted in the barren ground of her heart. In the weeks that followed, a strange, quiet routine settled over them. Sana explored the penthouse, a vast, silent world of art and luxury. She discovered the library and lost herself in books she'd never had the chance to read. She found the art studio and, with hesitant hands, began to sketch, a talent she'd buried long ago. Minjun was a constant, steady presence. He left early in the morning and returned late in the evening. They always had dinner together. Their conversations started small. He would ask what book she was reading. She would ask about a painting on the wall. He learned she had a deep, academic interest in botany, a dream she'd abandoned to work 2 jobs to support her father's habits. The next week, an entire corner of the large, sun-drenched living area began to transform. Workmen arrived, installing planters and irrigation systems. Then came the plants, rare orchids, delicate ferns, lush tropicals she had only ever seen in textbooks. He was building her a garden in the sky. He never mentioned it directly, simply gesturing to it one evening. I thought this room could use more life, was all he said. Sana was speechless. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. She began to spend most of her days there, tending to the plants, her hands in the soil. It was grounding. It was hers. She also learned to read him. She saw the tension in his shoulders when he came home after a difficult day. She noticed he favored his left side when an old injury flared up. He never spoke of his work and she never asked. But she started leaving a cup of calming herbal tea on the table for him when he came home late, a silent gesture of care. He would nod his thanks, his eyes conveying a gratitude that his words never did. The fear she'd once felt in his presence had slowly, imperceptibly, morphed into a feeling of profound safety. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, yet she was safer with him than she had ever been in her life. This paradox was the foundation of their strange, evolving relationship. Trust was being built not with words, but with quiet actions, with shared silence, with the unspoken understanding that they were 2 lonely people in a glass tower, finding solace in each other's company. The past shattered her newfound peace one rainy Tuesday afternoon. A package arrived for her. It was small, nondescript. The doorman, a polite but imposing man named Mr. Choi, brought it up personally, his face grim. This was left for you at the front desk. Miss Sana's blood ran cold. Minjun's security was absolute. Nothing got into this building without his approval. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single, wilted black rose and a note written in her father's spidery scrawl. He can't keep you locked up forever. You still owe me. A wave of nausea washed over her. The cage she had escaped was trying to drag her back. The familiar, suffocating fear returned, choking the air from her lungs. She was standing in her conservatory, the note crushed in her hand, when Minjun came home. It was hours earlier than usual. He took one look at her ashen face and the crumpled paper in her fist, and his entire demeanor shifted. The calm, controlled man was gone, replaced by something cold and lethal. What is it? He asked, his voice dangerously low. She couldn't speak, simply holding out the note. He read it, his expression turning to stone. The muscle in his jaw clenched. He took out his phone and made a call, speaking in rapid, harsh Korean. The words were unintelligible to her, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of a death sentence being passed. He hung up and looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. He found you, she whispered, her voice trembling. He will not get near you, Minjun stated, the words an unbreakable vow. He stepped closer, his instinct to reassure warring with his rigid control. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a shield. I will handle this. I give you my word, he will never be a threat to you again. He left a few minutes later, flanked by two of his most trusted men. Sana watched from the window as his black car sped away into the rain-slicked night. She didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do. She only knew that the monster she had feared for 23 years was about to meet a far more dangerous one, and this one was on her side. The thought terrified her and, to her shame, brought her a profound, gut-wrenching sense of relief. She waited up all night, tending to her plants under the soft glow of the grow lights, her hands shaking. He returned just before dawn, the sky outside turning a bruised purple. He looked tired, his perfect suit slightly rumpled. There was a small, dark stain on the cuff of his white shirt that she tried not to look at. He came to stand beside her in the conservatory, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. He looked at her, his face weary but his eyes clear. It's over, he said softly.
He's gone.
He will not be coming back. Ever, the finality of it hung in the air between them. He had erased her father from the world as easily as erasing a line of text. He had committed an unknowable act in her name, for her protection. She should have been horrified. And a part of her was. But the larger part, the part that had lived in fear for so long, felt a slow, profound release, like a tightly wound spring finally uncoiling. She looked up at him, at this man of violence and quiet kindness, and saw only her protector. Thank you, she whispered, the words feeling achingly inadequate. He simply nodded, his gaze holding hers, and in that shared look, something shifted. The line between protector and protected blurred, becoming something deeper, something more intimate, something that neither of them yet had a name for. The incident with her father, and Minjun's swift, brutal resolution, created a new kind of tension between them. The space he had carefully maintained began to shrink. He spent more time at the penthouse, working from his home office instead of his downtown headquarters. They fell into a comfortable domesticity that felt both natural and electric. She would bring him coffee, and their fingers would brush as he took the cup. He would find her asleep in a chair in the library, a book fallen to the floor, and would gently drape a blanket over her, his touch featherlight on her shoulder. One evening, she was in her conservatory, reaching for a climbing vine on a high trellis. The stool she was on wobbled, and she let out a small cry as she lost her balance. Instantly he was there. He moved faster than she thought possible, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her securely against his chest to steady her. Her back was flush against him, his heart thudding a strong, steady rhythm against her shoulder blades. His scent filled her senses, sandalwood and clean linen. Are you all right? His voice was a low rumble, right by her ear. She was perfectly fine, but her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the warmth of him, the solid strength of his body holding her. She turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing against the soft fabric of his sweater. Their faces were only inches apart. His dark eyes were no longer unreadable. They were filled with a raw, undisguised concern. And something else. Something deeper. A current passed between them, potent and unspoken. I'm fine, she managed to say, her voice breathy. His grip on her waist didn't loosen. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. The air crackled with unspoken questions. He was a man of absolute control, but in that moment, she saw a flicker of something vulnerable, something hesitant. It was he who finally broke the spell, gently setting her back on her feet, though his hands lingered on her arms for a moment longer than necessary. Be more careful, he said, his voice slightly hoarse. He stepped back, putting distance between them again, but the charged energy remained, a silent promise of something yet to come. The silent, protective wall he had built around himself was beginning to crumble, and Sana found she was no longer afraid of what lay behind it. A month later, their fragile peace was threatened from the outside. A rival faction, seeing Minjun's increased time at home as a sign of weakness, grew bolder. The first sign of trouble was a car that followed them on a rare trip out of the city to a private art gallery. Minjun's driver, the stoic Mr. Choi, handled it with unnerving calm, losing them in a series of sharp, unexpected turns. But Minjun's posture was rigid the entire way back, his hand resting almost imperceptibly on the inside of his jacket, where Sana knew he kept a handgun. The true attack came a week later. They were in the underground garage, about to get into his armored sedan, when two cars screeched around the corner, blocking their exit. Men in dark clothes spilled out, weapons raised. Before Sana could even process the threat, Minjun reacted. He shoved her behind him, pushing her toward the thick concrete pillar. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a whip crack of authority. He drew his own weapon with a fluid grace that was terrifying to behold. The next 30 seconds were a cacophony of shouts and deafening gunfire. Sana huddled behind the pillar, her heart pounding against her ribs. She peeked out once and saw him, a blur of motion, moving with a lethal precision that was both horrifying and awe-inspiring. He was not just a businessman, he was a warrior. When silence fell, heavy and ringing, Minjun's men had neutralized the threat. He came to her immediately, holstering his weapon as he knelt in front of her. His face was grim, his eyes scanning her for any injury.
"Sana?
"Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained with urgency. She shook her head, unable to speak. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking away a smudge of dust. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she had just witnessed. In the aftermath, back in the pristine safety of the penthouse, the adrenaline faded, leaving them both shaken. He had a shallow graze on his forearm, a thin line of red against his skin. She insisted on cleaning it, her hands surprisingly steady as she dabbed at the wound with antiseptic. He sat on the sofa, watching her, his usual control completely gone. He looked vulnerable. "They thought I was weak because of you," he said, his voice quiet and raw. "They thought having you here made me soft." Sana paused, the cotton swab hovering over his skin. She looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "Are you?" she asked softly. "Soft." A long silence stretched between them. "No," he finally answered, his voice rough with emotion. "I am more dangerous. Because now I have something to lose." The admission hung in the air, a confession more powerful than any declaration of love. He had built an empire on having nothing to lose, and she had just become his single, most precious vulnerability. In that moment, she understood the depth of his feelings for her, and she knew, with terrifying certainty, that she felt the same. That night, neither of them slept. They ended up by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights a silent, glittering audience below. The storm of the evening had passed, leaving a quiet intimacy in its wake. They stood side by side, not touching, but the space between them was charged with everything left unsaid. "I never intended for you to be part of this," Minjun said, his voice a low murmur. "This violence, this life, you didn't choose me," Sana replied, her voice just as quiet. "My father did. You chose to see me." He turned to face her, his expression serious, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "I see you, Sana. More than you know." He took a tentative step closer, and then another. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, giving her every opportunity to retreat. But she stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. This felt inevitable. It felt right. He raised his hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently touching her cheek, his fingers cool against her warm skin. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through her. "You have brought a quietness to my world that I never knew was possible," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made this empty place a home." Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. She had spent her life feeling invisible, and this man, this killer, this protector, saw her. He truly saw her. "You made me feel safe," she whispered back, her own confession. His eyes softened, and he leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. The world seemed to slow down, narrowing to this single point in time, to the space between their mouths. The first touch was impossibly gentle, a soft, hesitant press of his lips against hers. It was a question. She answered by leaning into him, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The kiss deepened, no longer hesitant, but filled with all the pent-up longing, the shared fear, and the unspoken tenderness that had grown between them. It wasn't a kiss of wild passion, but of deep, emotional release. It was acknowledgement. It was trust. It was the feeling of two broken, lonely souls finally finding their other half. When they finally broke apart, resting their foreheads together, they were both breathless. The barrier between them had been irrevocably shattered. They were no longer a protector and his ward. They were Minjun and Sana, and they were just beginning. After the kiss, their relationship transformed. The quiet understanding blossomed into an open, tender partnership. He held her hand when they sat and watched movies. She would read to him in the evenings, her voice a soothing balm to his chaotic days. He began to share parts of his world with her, not the violence, but the strategy, the complex web of alliances and power plays. He valued her sharp, intuitive insights. She saw that his empire, built on fear, was also maintained by a strict code of honor. He was a ruthless man, but he was not a cruel one. She, in turn, opened up about her past, sharing the painful memories she had kept locked away. He listened, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor. He never pitted her. He respected her resilience. He saw her strength, not her scars. Her conservatory became their sanctuary. It was where they talked, where they planned, where they simply existed together in peace. She had cultivated life in that sterile glass tower, and in doing so, had cultivated life in him, too. One evening, as she was pruning a night-blooming cereus, he came to stand behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sun set over the city. "I spoke with the board of my legitimate enterprise today," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "Kong Industries. We are expanding our philanthropic division," Sana smiled. "That's wonderful, Minjun. I recommended a new director," he continued. "Someone with a keen understanding of cultivation, of nurturing growth in barren places. Someone with a passion for botany and community gardens." She turned in his arms to face him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You mean, the position is yours if you want it," he said, his expression completely serious. "It's a real job, Sana. Your own office, your own projects, your own power." He was offering her not just a life with him, but a life of her own, a purpose that she had dreamed of but never thought possible. He wasn't just protecting her, he was empowering her. He was giving her back the agency her father had stolen. "Is this real?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "It is," he confirmed. "You are the most capable person I know." In that moment, the power reversal was complete. She was no longer a payment, no longer a protected ward. She was a director, a partner, an equal. Her past did not define her. Her future, a future he was helping her build, was bright and full of possibility. A year passed. Sana thrived in her new role, launching urban garden projects in underserved neighborhoods. She was brilliant, passionate, and respected. Minjun watched her with a quiet, profound pride. Their love had deepened, settling into a comfortable, unshakable bond. They were a team, navigating his dangerous world and her burgeoning professional one with mutual respect and unwavering support. The threats from his rivals had faded, his position more secure than ever, solidified by a partner who gave him a reason beyond mere survival. One cool autumn evening, he led her not to the dining room, but to her conservatory. The space was filled with dozens of flickering candles, their soft light dancing off the lush green leaves. In the center, a small table was set for two. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice filled with delighted surprise. He smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his face. He took her hands in his. "Sana," he began, his voice losing its usual controlled edge, becoming softer, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. A year ago, you came into my life as a debt. But you became my greatest asset. Not because of any value you offered my business, but because you gave value to my life. He squeezed her hands gently. You are my peace, my strength, and my conscience. The thought of a future without you in it is no future at all. He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a single, perfect diamond that shone like a captured star in the candlelight. He didn't kneel. He stood before her as her equal. I am not asking you to be a mafia wife, he said, his voice earnest. I am asking you to be my wife, my partner in all things, to build a life with me, a real life, filled with gardens and books and quiet evenings. Marry me, Sana. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of pure joy. Her answer was not one of obligation or gratitude for her safety. It was a choice, made freely, by a woman who was whole and strong and deeply in love. Yes, she breathed. Yes, mignon. I will marry you. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. It wasn't a shackle or a mark of ownership. It was a promise. A symbol of a partnership forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love that had grown in the dark and blossomed into something beautiful and strong. Their wedding was a small, private affair, held right there in their conservatory, the place where their love had truly taken root. There were no business associates, no underworld figures. The only guests were Mr. Choi and the elderly housekeeper, who had become like family. Sana wore a simple, elegant cream-colored dress. Minjun wore a dark gray suit, but he looked at her with such open adoration that his formidable aura was completely replaced by that of a man deeply in love. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, quiet words filled with promises of partnership, respect, and unwavering support. When he slid the simple gold band on her finger to join the engagement ring, he leaned in and whispered, "My sanctuary," she smiled, her heart full. "My protector," she whispered back. The ceremony was followed by a quiet dinner, filled with soft laughter and easy conversation. Later, they stood by the window, looking out at the city that had once been her prison and was now her kingdom. She leaned her head against his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. She thought of her father, a distant, frozen memory of a man. He had tried to sell her, to erase her. He had handed her over to a man he thought was a monster, hoping to see her broken. But he had failed. The monster had turned out to be a savior. The cage had become a home. The payment had become the most precious thing in his life. The man her father feared had given her everything her father had denied her: safety, respect, agency, and a love so profound it had reshaped her world. She was no longer Marcus's broken daughter. She was Sana Kong, a woman of power and purpose, and the cherished wife of the man who had seen the queen hiding inside the pawn.